I want to welcome Dr. Handford to be interviewed, and thank you for accepting my offer to do this. You are you're doing some amazing things, and I want people to sort of know about what you're doing. There's sort of three different areas that I want to focus on. First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, in terms of your background, and also you have a really cool job now, and I want you to talk a little bit about your job.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. So, in terms of me and kind of my background, I have been always been fascinated with the field of psychology. I was one of those like middle schoolers that found out about the study of human behavior and mind. It was like, oh, so this will help explain why my peers are so weird in the lunchroom or why middle school feels so weird. So really became enamored with the field of psychology from a young age. And just continued that quest of really studying the field of psychology and figuring out what interests me. And around the time that I started grad school, I started to think more about my lived experience as a Black woman and what that meant in terms of what I wanted to research and study, and really started to dive into the study of racial trauma and have found a love for being able to provide language and healing and community around this lived experience that we share as Black communities, and figuring out ways to help others that are navigating this experience.
Yeah, and so how would you define racial trauma? What are I'm sure there are
Yeah.
lots of definitions, but, like, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so racial trauma, it's defined as the real or perceived experience of racial discrimination. I tend to think of it as essentially the psychological experience of encountering and enduring racism or racist acts. And that can be things that are that you experience directly toward yourself or others, right? So just by witnessing racially traumatic acts that involve your loved ones, members of your community, or complete strangers, right? Because ethno-racial identity closely aligns to yours can elicit those same feelings.
Yeah.
And so that's how I think of racial trauma, like the psychological experience of racism.
Wow, great. And it's something I feel like it's important for people to understand and know, because you're that like those terms and understanding it can help sort of you understand like why you feel uncomfortable in certain situations or why you might avoid certain kinds of situations.
Absolutely. Language is power. That is my mission statement. That fuels a lot of the work that I do. I think that the experience of racism and the racist acts that happen in the world, it creates a lot of internal distress and confusion. If you don't have any words to wrap your feelings around, to articulate what you're experiencing, that experience is exacerbated, right? That feeling of distress, the feeling of hopelessness, it's made worse if you don't have any idea what's going on or don't know where to go for help. And so I think providing a language for racial trauma, thinking of models and frameworks that can help people explain to themselves, let alone other people, what's going on internally is so important.
Yeah. So in what ways does racial trauma can it lead to psychological disorders, or are there times that racial trauma can create things that look like symptoms of psychological disorders, but really aren't?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So we think about how racial trauma manifests. It differs from person to person, context to context. And we know that it's similar just to other trauma presentations or presentations of distress. But research shows that racial trauma does yield symptoms such as depression, anxiety, anger, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, or concerning physical symptoms from all the stress. So when you think about just those symptoms that I named, that could be misdiagnosed a thousand different ways, right? If no one's taking the time to think about the context that these symptoms are happening within, no one is thinking about, okay, from a holistic point of view, what is this person's lived experience? Was it racial identity? How does that show up in the space that they're in? You could certainly misdiagnose or misinterpret what is a true experience of hurt and pain related to negative or dangerous racial experiences.
Yeah, so the treatments must be very different because the treatment with depression, we have people in cognitive behavioral therapy sort of think through like, is this true? Is this really happening? To come out with a different kind of experience. That must be very different if the trauma is created by racial trauma.
Right, exactly, right? So it's the idea of not pathologizing someone's experience because they're having a very understandable, if you think about it, healthy response to a very troubling and dangerous lived experience, right? If you are constantly turning on the news and seeing hate crimes on TV, or every time you Google something, right, a new event that's happened that's shattered the world in terms of race related crimes is on your phone. Or when you go to school, no one tries to pronounce your name correctly, or they make fun of the food that you have at lunch, or they make comments about your ethno-racial identity that builds up and that builds up, right? And it creates an experience of hurt and pain that has to come out somehow, right? And so we see it in isolation or withdrawing or feeling hypervigilant. And the treatment for that isn't going to be, cognitive behavioral therapy. It will be, let's process your experiences. Let me validate that I see, I hear you, I understand what you're saying. Let's think about community. Let's talk about healing practices. How can we educate you more on what this experience is, what it feels like, why you shouldn't feel shame and guilt because you're the person that should be empowered in this situation, right? So it looks a bit different than other mental health presentations, and the treatment of it needs to look a little different as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was watching, The Gilded Age a couple of months ago, and I remember feeling anxious because I kept thinking, when is the terrible thing going to happen to the person that looks like me? Because in period pieces, something terrible always happens to the person that looks like me in those shows. And so it's so queuing up that anxiety constantly can be very exhausting for people.
Absolutely, right? When you think about racial trauma, and the example that you gave is a great one. Another way that it manifests is extreme fatigue, burnout, hypervigilance, because you're always on edge, you're always on guard. And that takes a level of activation internally that is exhausting.
Mm.
Right? When you think about the idea of constantly regulating and navigating thoughts and feelings related to racism in our country, in our world, it takes up a lot of energy and it leaves you with little energy or severely compromised energy when it comes to then focusing on the things that you want to, the things you deserve to focus your attention on. Um, and so that's a great example, right? Just this example of, okay, when is this gonna happen? I'm on it and I'm just trying to watch TV.
Right. Yeah, and it's not you don't watch it in the same way.
Right.
You're just sort of you're feeling protective of those characters in some way. Yeah,
It makes it harder to be present and just relax in the moment and find joy and connection with what you're actually doing.
great. So talk a little bit about your job. Tell me, but you've got a really cool job. Tell me about the job you currently have and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a program director for a mental health practice called the Black Girl Doctor. And it is a practice that has, we think of as two divisions. One is your traditional therapy, group therapy, coaching. And the other side is a workplace wellness division that really focuses on Black centered workplace wellness and takes what I think of as a social justice um, oriented lens when thinking about what can workplace wellness, what is the optimal workplace culture for Black employees. And so we work with organizations, companies, universities to help them create programming for Black individuals, to help them assess what their culture is like and how it can be better, provide healing spaces for Black individuals within companies, right? So that they can trust and relax a bit, right? When thinking about oh, hypervigilance when they're at work and know that these services are being prioritized by the company. So yeah, it's a really great experience. I love the job. I love everyone that I work with. And I find it to be really important work. This idea of really working to change systems, to create better systems. We think about work in school, we spend a lot of our time there. And so the idea of working with systems to make that large amount of time better for everyone that we come in contact with is something that I really appreciate getting the chance to do.
That sounds like a great organization. And so if they want to learn more about that, how can they find that organization online?
Yeah, so you can Google the Black Girl Doctor. We are out there. We're also on LinkedIn, we have an Instagram account. When you go on our website, there's a newsletter you can subscribe to. Lots of ways to get in contact with us in our main website. Lots of information and ways to contact us and work with us.
Yeah. So one of the things we talked about before was like these, and you talked about this a little bit in terms of what you do in your organization. We know there are sort of systematic issues that can lead to um, uh, racial trauma in many different communities. Psychology usually focuses on the individual, but in your organization, you're really working on more like larger interventions. So, what are some ways that because we usually think about a psychologist as someone who does individual therapy, but you're sort of involved in programming that's sort of beyond the individual. And so, how does that? So, talk a little bit about that because I think a lot of people are surprised that psychology can also operate on a community or organizational level.
Yeah, it's a great question. Can I personally think that every table should have a seat for a psychologist. When you think about the work that we do and the things that we study, it applies everywhere. And so my job is a great example of that. To your point, traditionally, when we think about psychologists, it is in the therapy room, it is helping people one on one in clinical sense. But think about these broader systems, they are made up of those individuals, right? They are made up of people and our tendencies as humans, our biases as humans, our behavior, thoughts, and feelings as humans. That all goes into creating a system. I think that anyone in the mental health field that works with clients one on one in a therapy setting can relate to the idea of we've all had a client that we've been working with for a while and they really appreciate our work and let us know that, this is really great. But when we're not in session and I have to go to work and deal with that stress or deal with this manager that says things that make me uncomfortable or deal with microaggressions or I don't want to go back to my office because I like being at home in my own space and not having to deal with things or my professor says things that feel off base to me as a Black person, but I look around and no one seems to be phased, right? We have all those incidents and we can't be there with them, right? As the therapist to help in that moment. So, how can we help those systems that are impacting us as individuals so greatly? And so, I think that having a broader systems perspective, and ability to work within systems as a psychologist, it showed me that we do really have a place everywhere because what we study impacts how these systems are run, impacts the way that leadership approaches their employees or their policy, their procedures. And so I think there's a lot of room and place and platforms for psychologists when it comes to systems based work.
Wonderful. And one of those areas is something that you wrote about in your book, uh, Racial Trauma in the School System, Naming the Pain. Talk a little bit about your idea about this book and like what are some like what's one key takeaway that you want people to know from this book?
That's a good question. So I think I'll start with what motivated this book to come about. So myself and the co-author, Dr. Ariel Marrero, we wrote this book because racial trauma is certainly something that we're both passionate about, but specifically when we think about children in K through 12 systems, racial trauma, right? Navigating racial trauma, experiencing it, it's a lot for anyone, right? As an adult, it's hard. think about it as a child who doesn't have that level of language, doesn't have that level of identity development, is really just trying to make it in this world and live their best life. And they're constantly being impacted by the adults and systems around them. What help are they getting? What um, level of advocacy are they receiving in terms of helping with this lived experience? So we came from that point of view in terms of what can we do to add to the culture of providing more language regarding the lived experiences of children who are experiencing racially traumatic school systems or experiencing things in the world and then have to come to class and figure out how to deal with that, right? Who are reading the news, who are seeing their parents and family freak out, and then also have to concentrate in math, um, and then also have to act like they didn't hear their classmate dismiss the story on the news, right? It's a lot. And so we thought, okay, so how can we reach the adults who are impacting this experience? And that's really where this book came from. And so we hope that it is helpful to school psychologists, teachers, administrators, everyone in the school system that wants to be more educated on this topic. And I would say one main takeaway hmm, would be full circle from what we talked about before. Racial trauma manifests in different ways. And taking the time to really think about the context from which the child that you are working with, like what they're experiencing, the context that their symptoms are manifesting in, that's so important. Um, a misdiagnosis can impact a child's whole life, their trajectory, what they do after school, um, and not taking the time to think about Mm. their experiences that are rooted in their ethno-racial identity that could do a disservice in terms of invalidating and dehumanizing them. So I'd say one takeaway is the idea that as important as understanding and having language for racial trauma is for adults, it is double, triple as important
Mm.
for children in terms of advocating for them to have the life that they deserve to live.
That sorry, thank you so much. It's always incredible to talk to you. I hope that people who watch and listen to this will get a little bit more information about how racial trauma can impact or even mimic psychological disorders, and also a little bit about how psychologists work in the community, in organizations, and in systems to change that. So, I want to thank you for your work and thank you for coming today to be interviewed.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Great.